Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name's Alex James, and this is our Blackberries in Waterways webinar with Christine Aughey and Lori Gould. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the National Land Care Program. The Small Farms Network Capital Region Incorporated is a grassroots information service based near Canberra. The volunteer committee help organise events and programs specifically designed for small farmers. This event would not be possible without their hard work and support. So I'm just going to let you know about the webinar tonight and what to expect. We will be chatting to local farmer Christine about her farm and then having a presentation from Lori Gould. After the presentation, we will be answering some of your questions. You can participate in this webinar by typing your questions into the chat box, which is on the side of your screen. Please select everyone when you send your message so that other people can see what you have asked. The chat box messages are saved. This webinar will be recorded and placed on the Small Farms Network Capital Region YouTube channel. Attendees cannot be seen in the recording. At the end of this webinar, I invite you to complete a survey that comes up when the Zoom session is finished. Your feedback helps us plan and deliver events like this one. So I'd just like to let you know a little bit about our speakers. Lori Gould specialises in riparian rehabilitation projects that focus on engaging the community in improving biodiversity, linking vegetation and addressing salinity. She is the Program Manager for the Rivers of Carbon at the Australian River Restoration Centre. Lori is practical, approachable and a great person to talk to about all things riparian. She is a skilled community practitioner and is always willing to share her experiences with others. Christine Aughey is an agricultural professional who is applying her knowledge of agriculture to rehabilitate a small farm in the Yass area. Christine is a Small Farms Network committee member, and I really appreciate her help with planning and running events like these. So Christine, I'm just going to invite you to turn your microphone on now. There we go, we've got you. Yep, that's sounding good. All right, so Christine, would you like to tell us a little bit about you and your farm and the issue that's happening on Fairy Hole Creek?
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Alex. Alex, if we could just slide to the next slide, please.
Yep.
So I bought a small property, 26 acres, on the outskirts of Yass. A few years ago. It was actually at the end of the drought. And we have, as Alex mentioned, we have Fairy Hole Creek running down along the back of the property. And it's always been a lifestyle property, and that's absolutely fine. Many of us use our properties to varying degrees. Some of us have a lot of production on the properties, other people use the properties less so. However, as I say, when I purchased the property, I noticed that the creek was very overgrown with mainly blackberries, as you can see, but there was also a lot of other habitat in the creeks. Because I want to bring the creek into, I suppose, the farm production area, I was really wanting to eradicate the blackberries particularly as much as possible. However, I reached out to the Small Farms community group and through to Lori Gould, as well as talking with others, because I'm wanting to try and keep the other biodiversity in the creek. So while getting rid of some plants, I want to try and keep other plants so that I don't want just a full-on eradication, taking it back to zero plant species. And so, as you can see in these two photos, the blackberries are quite large. There would be probably 4 large patches of blackberries in a 160-metre stretch. We've got about 170 metres across the back of the property, but access is particularly hard down there, mainly due to it obviously being a creek, but also the sides are fairly steep. And also obviously the blackberries mainly are inhibiting access to other areas of the creek. So it's not easy to get into the depths of the blackberries to control them from that way out. So I'm really struggling with the first step, I suppose, which is why I thought that this webinar might be helpful for people, because many of us are in this situation where it's a case of how do you eat an elephant? Yes, it is one bite at a time, but where do you take that first bite? And that's the point that I'm at right now. Is it's just large. There's 4 large areas, but also another aspect, as I said, I don't want to interrupt the other biodiversity. Another aspect that I have chatted with Lori about, and is certainly a front of my mind, is because it is on a creek that goes through other properties. So I don't want to put so much chemical on that the chemical then runs down the creek and pollutes the creek further down. I think we have a responsibility in these public waterways for the overall health of the creek, because we do only own part of the creek or oversee part of the creek. So this photo here shows, as I say, the strong biodiversity, but also the difficulty in getting to many of the blackberries. Next photo, please. Next.
Oh, I slipped that one in because I that was the long creek view.
That's a long sheet. Yeah. So
yeah,
the long.
You want me to skip over that one?
That's hey, I'll talk to any of them because I've got quite a lot of story to tell.
Yeah.
So, is there another one there, Alex, or is that the last?
Is that one? Is that the one you want?
Is there another one?
Yep. Oh, it's at the beginning. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That one.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
So this is showing just the terrain that we need to get through to get to the blackberries. Yeah, thanks. That's a great one. Yeah. So this photo really shows, and I took a lot of interest in a webinar that Alex brought together a few weeks ago around managing goats. Elizabeth, who has Herds for Hire down from Berry, she comes up and does creek management such as this, because it is very difficult terrain to get to, and I've seen the effectiveness on goats in areas like this without overly damaging the other plant species and the overall general ecosystem. So I felt that by seeing Elizabeth's management of the goats, she understands the broader ecosystem, and that yes, the goats are there to control X-weed, but when she sees the impact of the goats on the broader area, she can actively control that. So goats is something I'm thinking about from 2 aspects. use of chemicals, as I was just saying about the impact of chemicals downstream, but also that they can be used fairly selectively.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Mm.
So that's another conundrum for me that people might see if they choose to come to the site visit is the height of these blackberries. They have been let go for many, many years. And that's no one's fault. As I say, many people don't know. Small bushes like this aren't bad, but when you get into the size of these,
yeah,
you've got many elephants. It's not just how you eat one elephant. You've got a herd of elephants to deal with. So
yeah,
yeah,
okay,
yeah, that's where I am right now.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right. So do you feel like we've covered off on your the things you wanted to say, Christine?
I've certainly explained the situation. If anyone has any questions later on, happy to answer. But yeah, that's an overall summary of where I'm at, why I'm presenting it, and happy to have a further discussion.
All right, brilliant. Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to stop my share there and invite Lori to join us and to share her screen and start her presentation. So, Lori, you're on mute if you want to.
I was just finding the button.
Ah, there we go. Brilliant. Excellent.
The usual faffing around before talking. All right, I'll share and then I'll put the slideshow on. Can you see that okay?
Yep, that looks great. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thanks everyone for coming along on this Thursday night. It's probably nicer being inside than being outside, judging by the temperatures of late. But just before I start, I'll just let you know a little bit about my background so you know who I am. About 25 years ago, I started my career as a ranger on the Murrumbidgee River in the ACT and spent a hell of a lot of my time spraying all different types of weeds. So without giving it a lot of thought, to be honest, as to why I was doing it, I was just doing it because it was my job. And then I stayed there for 5 or 6 years and then went and worked with Greening Australia for 16 years, delivering a lot of programs on farms. And I ended up specialising mostly in river rehabilitation, which is where my studies have related to, but also lots of broad scale sustainable agricultural type programs as well. And the last 5 years, I've been doing a lot of consulting sort of work. A lot of that's with around landscape planning with parks and conservation. But one of my main roles is managing the Rivers of Carbon project for the River Restoration Centre. And I really love doing that job because it's a whole bunch of different projects over different areas across southeast New South Wales that all focus on really specific things. So, for example, our Sydney Water Catchment project focuses entirely on getting cattle out of waterways for human health in the Sydney water catchment, whereas a project up in Cooma is about protecting habitat for Macquarie perch and landholders, fencing and protecting rivers, but also putting back aquatic habitat and things like fish hotels. So it's a really diverse program. And the relevance for tonight is that we've just got funding for YAS Rivers of Carbon Stage 3. So we'll be doing some work around YAS, and part of that is blackberry management in relation to waterway management. So I just thought I'd mention that. And also on the Rivers of Carbon website is a step-by-step guide, I suppose you'd call it, a landholder guide to managing blackberries in waterways. And that's where a lot of this talk has been drawn from, amongst other areas, and a bit of experience. So just to let you know that's there. And also at the end of the talk, I'll put up the website and a few other useful resources for you. We tend not to print out a lot of stuff these days, but there's some very good information on that Rivers of Carbon website about anything to do with waterways, basically, and they're very easy to understand guides, which always suits me when I have to read a lot of things. So I just thought I'd give you a bit of context in terms of how all of us fit together. And I've worked with Alex for many, many years now and been out to Christine's a couple of times. So it's lovely to be working with you both again. So before I get into blackberries though, I think it's really important to understand blackberries in the context of weeds, because as I said, when I was a ranger, I spent all these years putting lots of chemical into the environment, not really questioning why I was doing it. Usually I was just doing it to reduce weeds, but I think over the years I've sort of transformed my thinking a little bit into wondering, thinking why am I doing this, observing a lot of weeds and the behaviour of weeds across the landscape, and switching more to doing it for a purpose such as biodiversity conservation. So a lot of our weed control programs are about, I've reduced weeds by X hectares, and certainly a lot of our funding bodies will require us to report on that. Whereas I prefer to now sort of look at it, well, it's kind of irrelevant how many hectares of weeds we've reduced. What we really want to know is what outcomes we've achieved in terms of improving biodiversity and reducing threats to high quality areas and farming production as well, of course. So the way, and I've been working a lot with the weeds officers at ACT Parks and Conservation Service, and similarly around 2016 with the introduction of the Biodiversity Conservation Act, weeds are now managed more on the basis of outcomes rather than in the past approach we've taken. There's nothing wrong with our past approach, but we've certainly learned a lot over those years. So there are different types of weeds, obviously, and one that's got a lot of focus over the years are the things like St. John's wort, thistles, Patterson's curse, all of those weeds that seem to spring up every time it rains and you never know really where they come from. But really, the weeds that we're interested in are the ones that actually have the ability to transform landscapes or transform highly biodiverse areas into areas that are ultimately become monocultures. So we call those the transformer weeds. Blackberry is certainly one of them. Things like briar, a lot of the woody weeds actually fall into that category because they spread quite readily, including some of the invasive native species. And it also depends on the context as well. What is it actually threatening, or is it just a patch in the middle of a paddock that may not be all that important? So other transformer weeds are things like serrated tussock, African lovegrass, Chilean needlegrass, things that just can't easily get outcompeted by native vegetation. Whereas our annual herbaceous weeds, what we've noticed this year after a couple of years or 10 years of drought and a couple of years of rain, is we've had a boom of weeds. There's been an absolute explosion of weeds, including places where we've been spraying them for 30 years. So what we've observed as we go around the landscape, and if you look at the picture there on the left, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but I will assume you can. Things like St. John's wort that crop up, quite densely in places. This year, while they had a really big boom they really respond to bare ground and they really respond to high nutrients. So after the drought, lots of rain, lots of weeds. But what we're noticing now is that in areas where there was good biomass and good diversity of native grasses and pasture species for that matter, we've noticed that they're starting to get the upper hand in a lot of places and are actually competing really well with things like St. John's wort and Patterson's curse and those sorts of things. So they tend to be really dominant in areas where the ground cover's low and where there's high nutrients, like stock camps are classic for having masses of thistle. And so over time, what we're starting to notice is because the native grasses like redleg grass and thermida and the stipers, the spear grasses are having such a good year, when you look, even though you've got last year's seed heads, when you actually look amongst that vegetation, we're finding there's not a lot of rosettes in many of these places. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to the rule. There are different situations, but in a lot of cases, as the nutrients are being used up, the phosphorus is being used up, the native grasses, which aren't as don't like phosphorus as much as a lot of these weeds, are actually getting a bit of a toehold in. So a lot of areas now, you can see the fleabane in the background there in that second photo. Fleabane loves water, it loves moisture, and people have been saying to me, oh, I've never seen it before on my property, largely because it's been drought for so long, that those kind of weeds are very responsive to climate. So a lot of those weeds will just drop out of the system again through our next drought. So, and things like St. John's wort and our phosphorus loving plants actually provide reasonable biomass, and they also use up the nutrients to favour the native vegetation. So in that situation, instead of trying to eradicate all of the weeds, we're looking at more of a containment strategy and a biomass ground cover strategy to enable those plants to actually, to enable our native plants to actually get the upper hand. And then this photo here, there's just a whole bunch of fleabane responding to a little moist spot in that part of the landscape. And it probably was an old stock camp under a tree or something like that. So now we're sort of viewing these sorts of weeds as, well, what are they actually doing? What's the trajectory of them? What's the ground cover like? Rather than just going out and spraying things, trying to eradicate, because after 30 years of spraying in this particular reserve, the wart just sprung up again after the drought when it rained. So the other new research that's sort of coming out at the moment, I think it's been submitted for publishing in Biology Conservation Journal or something like that, is they've done a lot of work around the impacts of star rain, which is commonly used to control St. John's wort. And they found that it's actually knocked out pretty much all of our native peas, which are nitrogen fixers. So things like the glycines and all those little forbs and things that were once there, the star rain's actually impacting on them. So we're starting to just view it a little bit differently. And I mentioned this just to try to, I guess, encourage people to look at what's happening in your patch and see try to work out what the actual trajectory is likely to be over time, and whether you do just contain them, some part of that strategy might be to keep them out of the really good areas. And the other thing I noticed too is after the bushfires, I did about 50 site visits in the Southern Highlands for Wingecarribee Council to advise people on the regeneration of their bush after those catastrophic fires. And what I really noticed across the board was the invasion of weeds in the bushland that was intact before the fires is very minimal. The weeds tended to just be in those cleared areas with the higher nutrients, or because of some other disturbance, there might have been a track pushed through. So that was a really interesting observation as well. And also they create a level of biomass. If you look on the right, that's all just mustard weed. It's responding to really high nutrients, a history of stock grazing, a big stock camp under a tree, and to spray all that would leave virtually nothing there. So while it's hard to look at, particularly for the rangers that manage that reserve, there's no real benefit to going and spraying it all. It's more of a containment strategy and try to get some native trees and shrubs planted into that area to compete with it. So I just wanted to provide that context, because what we're really focusing on is our transformer weeds like blackberry. The other thing to watch, of course, is any new and emerging weeds that are coming out that we don't know a lot about. I certainly noticed things like the blue periwinkles starting to take over vast areas of some sites, and things like that will cause a complete monoculture. Whereas, and once I've noticed, once that's sprayed, you do get a big diversity of weeds and native grasses and pasture species coming back, which is diverse and better than just having one type of plant. So I guess it's sort of looking at plants as plants and seeing what they're doing in the landscape and what the threat is to our native ecosystems. So just wanted to provide that context first, just as something to think about. And I will get on to Blackberry. So blackberry, we came into Australia in the 1840s for berry production, of course, but interestingly, it also it was introduced for stream bank erosion. So it was actually actively planted in a lot of places to control erosion. Hence, well, part of the reason it's along rivers is because it loves those conditions, but part of it is also because it has been planted there in the past or seeded. And in 1851, a fellow called Baron von Müller, which was the Victorian government botanist at the time, decided that the introduction of blackberry was a really fantastic way of improving equality of access to fruit year round. So what he was saying is that people who couldn't afford fruit, I've just noticed the typo, that's annoying, couldn't afford to buy lots of fruit. Blackberry was such a fantastically productive plant that anyone could access it. I'm not sure about the all year round thing, but certainly interesting history there. There's about 16 different types or different species of Rubus fruticosus, which is the blackberry that we're familiar with. And I found it really interesting. In our part of the world, there's maybe about 9 different types. And that's why some of the blackberries you see are quite different to others. And I'll put up a list of those in a second. But I just wanted to point out, we have our native raspberry as well, which looks at different times of the year can look very similar to blackberry. It has a much smaller leaf and a much smaller, much more red fruit. But when blackberry is very young and it's starting to get its new fruit, it can look very similar. So just something, I mean, a lot of people understand that, but I have also known native raspberry to be sprayed as well. It is quite similar. As I said, the leaves are smaller, but they often have a little red margin around the edges of them. So, you know, they're easy enough to identify if you take the time to look closely. So I just thought I'd point that out. So here's all of our different types of Rubus fruticosus, and this is just New South Wales. And it's interesting because they really colonised different areas, and I'm not sure if that's a result of different types being introduced into different areas, and then some were more successful than others, or whether lots of different types were introduced into lots of different areas and some were happier than others. So it's just interesting to know. I don't think it makes a lot of difference in terms of blackberry management, but it does explain why some blackberry plants have really dark green, big leaves, and other ones are maybe smaller and a much lighter green. The fruits tend to be slightly different, but mostly the fruit is different due to varieties that we use for production. So the really big long blackberries that are in the shops at the moment, or you know, the different types are often more to do with them being developed for production. So anyway, interesting. I found that really interesting because for years I didn't realise that. I just assumed they were all the same plant. But in terms of biosecurity, so the rules, I guess you would call them, with blackberry, they're recognised as a problem, and we, under the rules, the Biosecurity Act, we have a duty to prevent, eliminate or minimise them, but minimise the risk that they pose. So it doesn't say we necessarily have to control them all. In the past, it did say we had to, they'll really focus on eradication. With the new laws in 2016, it's more about looking at them as a risk. And it's people who know that they're a risk, but others, people like myself, I guess, who ought to know, you have to try to prevent or eliminate that risk as far as you can. So, and also it mustn't be imported anymore or sold, exchanged, offered for sale, but all of the fruit species, the production fruit species, the different varieties, they're accepted from those rules so that people can still obviously farm them and produce them. So we all have blackberries. And the reason I find them just an amazing plant, because the reason they're so successful is mainly, well, they're very long living species, but they've just got these amazing survival strategies that a lot of other plants don't have. I'll just move that over. So in the first year, you know, the canes grow really quickly. They don't have that many leaves. They tend not to fruit. And every single point where the canes touch the ground, they grow baby plants called daughter plants. So, you know, that's an amazing strategy. Once they've got all their, gone as far as they can with their canes, and you can imagine that all of those daughter plants then also grow canes, and then everywhere it touches the soil, another one grows. Then in year 2, they grow more leaves, they fruit, and that's when they start to drop seeds, and things like birds will cut them around the landscape. And obviously over the cooler months, they go a little bit more dormant. I think they're semi-deciduous as opposed to fully deciduous, but the leaves yellow a bit and start to drop off. But not only that, and that gets them through winter with a minimal expansion of energy. They also are prickly, as we know. They have a very waxy coating all over them. They've got a secondary root system that develops under the soil, and it can actually extend for up to 4 meters under the soil. So you can imagine whatever you do to the top of the plant, really, they've got this whole strategy going on underneath the soil. And they're very adaptive to a lot of different landscapes. We know that they like being in, you know, moist sort of areas best. They grow really well there, but they can also grow up on a rocky hilltop as well. So very adaptable plant. So the importance of blackberry, and while they're really good to eat and they're extremely productive in terms of producing fruit, because of their success, they are very widespread in Australia now. So they're noxious in all states and territories, and they're a weed of national significance due to their impacts on biodiversity and their ability to spread. They have the ability to infest large areas very quickly, and as I mentioned, they're fruiting within 2 years after they've established all their daughter plants. And they're very, very good at smothering native vegetation, just because of it's so dense. The cover is so dense, nothing can actually grow. Occasionally you see a few bits of phalaris sticking up through it, but by and large, there's not a lot of other vegetation that grows under it. And the problem with having that monoculture then is it has a much lower habitat value. While it does provide habitat for certain animals and insects and birds, it is a much lower diversity, so it supports a lower diversity of wildlife, basically. So it's that monoculture that's the issue, not necessarily the plant itself. It has the ability to completely change a lot of native ecosystems, and then also there's impacts on primary industries. Grazing and cropping lands very much reduces productivity, and not to mention that it can impede access, as Christine was saying. It's very, very hard to get down around the creek at her place. I don't know if you've been through some of the old forestry blocks where your 4-wheel drive is just being scratched from both sides from canes and canes of blackberry. But yeah, interestingly, the forestry, well, certainly in the southern parts of the ACT, they used to aerial Velpar spray to knock out everything. And then they put their pines in, and one of the first things to come back would be blackberry. So, you know, it obviously wasn't as affected by that treatment as all the other plants in those pine forest areas. So it's just testimony, I suppose, to its ability to survive. So along rivers, of course, it likes those high moisture conditions, so it has a very good ability to spread. And there's also a few crack willows in there. Crack willows are another transformer weed, and I won't say much about them other than they have a similar effect, as opposed to something like weeping willows or even poplars, which don't really seem to spread all that aggressively. But yeah, they love that riparian environment. And in terms of access, once you get lots of blackberry along the river, then it's very hard to get to for stock or humans. And And the other problem too, having it right on the riverbanks, is it has an effect on all of our aquatic wildlife. So it restricts the growth of the diversity of trees, shrubs and grasses, aquatic plants, reeds, and all of the things that work together to create our functioning ecosystems. So if we have a diversity of insects, for example, then it supports a range of aquatic life as well as birds and other wildlife. These blackberry supports are much lower. They form much simpler ecosystems because we don't have the range of inputs in terms of food webs. And things like platypus and water rats and our fish and that sort of thing are very, very reliant on not only shade over the water, but all the different types of bugs that drop into the water for them to forage on. And in the case of platypus, obviously their access to the bank's very restricted as well. So they have a special kind of impact on rivers, I suppose. And they tend to grow a lot better, as I mentioned. So in terms of management and control, and this kind of relates to what I started off saying about weeds, the first question is why, so instead of looking at blackberries and saying we've got to kill them, and quite aside from the legislation and the rules, on your own property, you're saying, well, why do we need to control them? What is it doing to the landscape? What's the trajectory that's likely to occur? For example, on Christine's, on Fairy Hole Creek there, the trajectory there might be that they'll continue to spread and further reduce diversity. And I don't think those photos did it justice, which is why I'd love it if people could come out to her place on Saturday. The diversity on that creek is just phenomenal. And there are big patches of just blackberry and nothing else. And the trajectory there would be, okay, they'll continue to spread and reduce diversity. So that might be a reason to try to manage them. And in some areas, it might just be that they're potentially providing a threat to really intact ecosystems, or there might be a particular threatened species. Certainly in secondary grasslands where we've got all our little critters like the golden sun moths and earless dragons and legless lizards and various other things with missing body parts. You know, blackberry is a massive threat to things like secondary and primary grasslands, and also woodland areas where we might have threatened species as well. So we really need to clarify why we want to control them. And in cases where there's just a lot of maybe small plants or regeneration of blackberry in some of our more high conservation value areas, it might just be a case that it's quite simple to get on top of those. It's mainly when they start to get into big clumps that we have issues in terms of actual physically controlling them, but then also they do provide some habitat for small woodland birds, which I'll talk a little bit about after. So the approach would be to prioritise for those small plants, to contain areas of big plants until you've thought through what the strategy might be, which relates to, are you looking to eradicate? Are you looking to reduce the infestation or just contain it to where it is? What's the time frame? And that will depend on whether you need a gradual approach or whether you can control them all in one hit. Often, as I said, if it's good habitat for woodland birds, you do need to stage it. Think about the method that you're trying to use, whether it's a physical method of reducing them, whether it's chemical herbicides, whether there's biological. The biological controls tend to be useful in really remote areas where we just can't get to. They're a very slow method, but they can restrict their growth enough to reduce their threat to ecosystems. Do we need special equipment? Do we need long hoses? Do we need specific chemicals? Do we need machinery? There's a whole range of things to consider. What are the off-target impacts? As I said, habitat for birds, waterway health, as Christine mentioned about putting chemicals into waterways. As I said, the habitat, and what are the ways in which we can replace the value of those blackberries with native vegetation? Is it feasible? Do we need any specific knowledge skills, and do we have the capacity to do it ourselves, where, you know, some people might be able to tackle it themselves as part of farm business. Other people might need to get contractors in, which might require grant funding. So it's really important to think through all these things. And I guess I'm guilty of it. When I was saying earlier, when I was a ranger, I would just tear out there with my quick spray on the back of the ute and just spray things as part of a weed program, granted. But I more or less was just doing it because it was a weed oftentimes. And it's been over the years, I've been reflecting on that a little bit. I'm not saying it was necessarily a negative outcome, but it was just that sort of, I want to promote the reasons why we're doing it and the importance of thinking all these things through before going ahead. So one of the most, I suppose the most effective treatment, unfortunately, is actually herbicide. They're pretty much the only, it's pretty much the only thing that will kill it and will kill the roots and will kill the seeds, depending on the herbicide that we use. I'll talk about some of the other control methods as well, of course, but the issue is that when you've got lots and lots of blackberry, and as this method, you're faced with using lots and lots of chemical, because you have to, well, the plant must be very actively growing, which means it's quite dense in terms of its vegetation. And you need to treat the whole plant, including the middle of the plant, which is very hard to get to. And that requires the correct spray pressure. So you're trying to get spray pressure that will penetrate into the middle of the plant, but then not put excess chemicals into the environment. So once you get your spray pressure high enough that droplets are bouncing back off the leaves, it's too high. So it's this really tricky balance. Getting the dilution of chemicals is easy. There was a bit of research done with spray contractors. The big difference was the amount of chemical going onto the plant. That's very hard to manage, and even our most experienced contractors still have to find that spot, that sort of middle spot there. In waterways, some of the chemicals that are commonly used are things like methylfuran, which is things like brush off or cut out. They've got lots of trading names. Triclopyr, which is grazon, and glyphosate, which is used to be called Roundup Bioactive. I suspect it probably still is. And there are so many products on the market that are mixtures of all of these things. So sometimes it might be methylfuran with triclopyr or triclopyr with glyphosate. There's a lot of brands that mix them up. So it's important to have a look at New South Wales DPI Weed-Wise site has a really great fact sheet on blackberries, which includes all the chemical use. I've got a link for that. And there's also a blackberry control manual that also goes through all the different chemicals, the pros, the cons, the limitations, because some will work better depending on the growing conditions of certain plants at different times of the year. Others are really quite specific to different types of blackberries. So if you've got certain species on your property, some work better on others. But I think for the purpose of this, those three chemicals tend to be most commonly used. The issue with waterways is that glyphosate is the only chemical registered for use along waterways. And glyphosate is non-selective, so it pretty much kills everything that it touches. And it's non-residual, so it doesn't kill the seeds. It will kill the plant, but it doesn't kill any of the seeds. It's not retained in the soil for very long. So it can have variable effect on root systems and that sort of thing. So that's a limitation. And the tricky thing to watch is a lot of the things like brush off and grazon, some of the brands will actually have glyphosate mixed in with it. And that improves its effectiveness in some areas, but unfortunately it also means that you're restricted for use on waterways if you've got those other chemicals in with the glyphosate. However, having said that, you can get a minor use permit from the Australian Pesticides and Veterinary Medicines Authority, and I know Snowy Land Care have one of these permits to tackle some of the blackberry issues. And there's also some best practice that you need to demonstrate to get that. So in this picture, this fellow is standing in the water and spraying spraying the blackberry up on the bank. And whilst there is chemical, there will be spray drift going into the water. It's a lot better than sort of spraying that from the bank. So you're sort of reducing your risk. One of the good ways of doing that is in summer when the blackberries tend to be actively growing and the creeks are often dry. So a lot of our ephemeral waterways, it really gives us an opportunity to use some off-label, with the use of off-label permits to actually get on top of them during that time. But certainly putting lots of chemical into the water is not advisable. In the case of somewhere like Christine's, it might be that during dry times, you can stand in the channel, spray some of the blackberries on the banks, and the impacts will be minimal. And if you're using the right chemical, the kill will be a lot greater, for example, than if you're just using glyphosate. So it's weighing up, I guess, the benefits and the risks of any different chemicals, and also making sure if you do use contractors that they are very clear, they very clearly know what they're doing if they're working around waterways. Most of them do, but there are the odd ones out there that may not be fully across it. Also, we put wetting agents in and penetrants, and they're quite useful for helping the chemicals stick to the plant and penetrate through that waxy coating. But they're also tend to not be registered for use along waterways either. So things like pulse and that sort of thing, again, you would need to incorporate that into your minor use permit. And then things like dyes, beetroot dyes and that sort of thing are really handy just to know where you're sprayed. I was talking to a contractor who was actually tying bits of toilet paper onto the blackberry so he could monitor the kill effect, because he felt the toilet paper lasted a lot longer than the dye. So I thought that was an interesting technique. And there are some requirements for spraying. The best time to spray, unfortunately, is when the plants are fruiting. And so if it's an area people are likely to be collecting blackberry, you either need to not spray while it's fruiting or put up lots and lots of signs. That's a requirement, I think. And also another requirement, which I didn't realise until recently, was you need to notify downstream neighbours within 500 metres if they use that river for their stock or domestic use. And you need to give them a week's notice so they can either make other arrangements or have the opportunity to discuss what might suit. So just to make sure that the stock then aren't drinking chemical laden water. One would hope that the chemicals in the water would be relatively minimal if it's done properly, but it's not always the case. And then following up, interestingly, because of the life cycle of the blackberry, where the first year is really establishing itself, the follow-up usually doesn't occur for 2 years from the original knockdown. So when the plant is really actively growing, obviously seedlings are a bit different. You can, they'll be actively growing. Well, they virtually need to be 2 years old, but if they're not attached to the main plant, obviously you've got other options with those. And so it's very hard to watch. So you spray a big patch of blackberry and you usually get a reasonable cure rate, but there will generally always be some regeneration, and then you have to wait for that to be actively growing before you can spray it again. So it is quite a long-term, for big plants, it can be a long-term proposition. And that's, I guess, where the planning comes into it as well. They're a very, very difficult plant to control, which I think is pretty obvious. And then we've got the physical control methods like burning, slashing. Slashing can be with a brush cutter, it can be with a machine, anything that just knocks at the biomass of the plant, the above ground mass of the plant. Grazing, as Christine mentioned, with goats. Goats are one of the only things that will actually eat them, although cattle will eat very small emerging plants. And then things like grubbing them out if you've only got very small bushes in isolated areas, noting that you need to get right down and get all those roots out. So there will, most of the time, that's almost impossible. So there's follow-up and monitoring. Generally, they suggest once a year if you're grubbing plants out to go back and just check whether they're regenerating or not. The thing about physical control is nothing you can do above ground, apart from spraying, will actually kill the plant. So where it becomes really useful, so it's very, very difficult in organic sort of farming settings. There's certainly nothing wrong. And the other thing too is that I hadn't mentioned earlier is if you've got a big blackberry bush in your garden and you're using it for fruit, obviously that's fine. You wouldn't be looking to control it. So, and there's a few organic fruit farms around that actually do that. And a lot of farmers that I know as well have the odd crop. But reducing biomass can help to gain access to the plants. They will regenerate, and the way a lot of people use physical control is they will knock down the main bulk of the plant whenever they can, whether it's even when the canes are a bit dormant. And then when the plants regenerate and start to grow, that's when they'll go in and spray them. So it really is to reduce the bulk to be able to get in, and that in turn can then reduce the use of chemicals. So in Christine's case, she might get the goats in, try to reduce that biomass. I'm really pleased to hear that the goat herder, I didn't quite catch her name. I'm really pleased to hear that she's really aware of the other biodiversity elements, because goats, they eat a lot of different things, obviously, but done properly, they're certainly not a bad tool. But then the idea would be to get that biomass down and then wait for it to regenerate, and then that's when you go in and spray it, and that will reduce a lot of chemical, but it is also extra work, a lot of extra work as well. So just balancing up what's, you know, in that situation, it's a good idea because it will reduce chemical going into the creek itself. The amount of chemical that will be required on those clumps is quite significant. The only problem is that it reduces the effectiveness of herbicide because the plant gets stressed, and it takes a while for it to start to grow again, so that it has enough leaf cover to then be able for the herbicide to be effective. Burning's a bit of an interesting one, because while it reduces the bulk of the plants, it also creates conditions that are favourable to the blackberry to regenerate. So the blackberry, when it gets burnt, actually digs its roots deeper into the soil. So the reach of its roots actually is further than if it wasn't burnt. And that picture there is actually Bumbalong Valley on the Murrumbidgee River after the big fires that we had a couple of years ago. And we ended up with, you know, the landholders and everybody raced down and planted it. I think I've got a photo of that here, come to think of it. Oh, yes, here we are. So after the fires there, the landholders and land care and everyone raced down and planted lots of native trees and grasses and shrubs to try to enhance that section of the river and help it recover from fire. But within a very short time, well, it was within the last 2 years, maybe a year, maybe 18 months, we've ended up where the blackberries have been very aggressive in their regeneration because they prefer the, well, I guess the extra phosphorus, the ash, and they've just come back and taken over. So they're being addressed at the moment in a strategic way, but it just sort of demonstrates how effective and efficient this particular plant is in terms of, so burning, it's also often illegal to burn along waterways as well because you take out all of the other vegetation. And once the phosphorus is increased, we'll also get back a lot of the annual weeds and that sort of thing as well, which, as I mentioned earlier, they favour that sort of condition. So it's a bit tricky deciding what to do. in terms of, usually with blackberry control, it's a combination of things. It might be some containment, some physical reduction in bulk, some use of chemicals, and a gradual strategic approach. And I think having a strategic approach is really good for people's mental health. So instead of looking at it and going, oh my God, I've got all this blackberry, you have a plan. It might be over 3 or 4 years, and you go, right, year one, I'm doing this bit. This might be 20, 30% of the blackberry in a particular area. Year two, I'm doing this, year three. And so then you just stick to your plan, and you know you've got a plan, and you know you're addressing it, but you're not, it sort of reduces the stress, I guess, of constantly wondering what to do with it. So I find that, and big infestations also, I'll talk about erosion and habitat, but they do, like, as I said, have some values which need to be managed as well. The other thing that we have is our blackberry leaf rust fungus, Phragmidium violaceum, and it attacks the leaves, and it actually makes the blackberries die back, which, whilst it doesn't kill them, it actually reduces their rate of spread. So it's really handy up in the alpine areas or places that we can't often get to. And interestingly, at the moment, they're in the more temperate area. They tend to be more efficient, I guess, or what's the word for it, more successful in the temperate areas. But with the predictions for climate change, CSIRO have done quite a lot of work, and blackberries set to increase into more of the cooler parts of places like Tasmania and the Alps. So it's something that will need to be sort of managed in future. But things like the rust can actually just help it to prevent it from forming those enormous big bushes. The problem is that it really likes humid conditions. So in our part of the world, it's not as humid, so the effectiveness of the rust is lower. But the other good thing about it is, because the plant gets a bit stressed because it takes all the nutrients and water out of the cells, it actually allows other plants to grow amongst the blackberry bush. So it lets sunlight in, and grasses and things can establish, so which improves diversity to some degree. The rust itself actually reduces the uptake of herbicide, so it can make it difficult to control. Oh God, I shouldn't do that. But yeah, there's also another critter, a little mite, that there was some research done about, I think it was in Western Australia, they were talking about releasing a mite as well, but there are implications for our fruit. It affects the fruit particularly, so there were implications about our fruit production, and also it only works on certain types of blackberries. So I'm not sure where that ended up getting to. I remember there was some talk of it. I haven't heard a lot about it recently. I'm not sure it actually ended up being released, but I could be wrong about that. I haven't looked into it for a while. So as I mentioned, some of the risks of controlling blackberries is things like erosion, because they tend to have bare ground underneath them, and the canes often will reduce the effects of raindrop fall. Less so on stream bank erosion, because that tends to affect the toe of the bank, which becomes unstable, but it very much depends on the system. So things like the soil type are very important. Removing blackberry on really sodic soil can have a negative impact. And so the way that we sort of manage that, I suppose, is to, in a lot of cases, if it's appropriate to spray it, we'll leave the canes there just to degrade over time, plant vegetation around it, try to improve this in-stream complexity by having lots of reeds and rocks and logs and things to reduce the flow, so other means of managing erosion. And then the habitat loss, there's things like the red-browed finch in this photo, which really love blackberry, whether it's just for cover, whether it's eating insects, probably a combination of both. there are certain little birds and things that really, and even I've even found wombats on quite a few occasions living under big blackberry thickets as well, where they're digging in underneath them. So they do have some habitat value. And in situations where there's nothing else, it needs to be carefully considered as to what impact controlling it will have. We have obviously some options around putting back native trees and shrubs to replace that habitat, staged approach. Rainer Raywinkle, who many of you will know, suggested about 30% reduction per spraying season. I'm not sure where the figure came from, but it makes sense to maybe just try to control a third rather than taking the whole lot out. And I'll just expand on those 2 points a little bit. So, for example, in this creek, I think that was near Gundaroo or Gunning or somewhere, the blackberry in this situation is actually providing a level of stability because the soil there is so sodic, it just washes away every time it rains, every time there's a stream flow. Even though the base of the creek is quite stable, those outer banks have not reached an equilibrium. So rivers and creeks they'll erode down, usually through a nick point or something. And then once they've reached bedrock or stabilized at the base, they will start to lay back, or what we call self-batter. So the walls start to lay back. And in this case, that hasn't happened. So here you would need to be looking at not only leaving the canes, but maybe putting in a little rock groin or something above the blackberry to deflect the flow away from that bank, maybe some rock, maybe some logs, and looking at some other erosion control measures there to reduce the risk of wash if you were to control those blackberries. However, in a setting like this one where the erosion's already occurred, it's a very old gully, it's reached its extent both headward and apart from a little bit of wash around this bank up here, it's the blackberry is really doing very little in terms of stabilizing that gully. And there's a lot of native grasses that will come back as well. So in that situation, and the soils they're probably a bit sodic, but they're not as bad as that previous photo. So in that situation also, there's not a lot of other vegetation around that gully. So that blackberry in that gully is probably more important for our little woodland birds and things. It probably provides a bit of shelter for them in an otherwise very clear landscape. So that's where we would look at planting trees and shrubs and putting back some of that shrubby habitat, allowing it to grow and then controlling the blackberries. Or you could do them consecutively where you plant trees and shrubs and then you just control some of, maybe in that case, maybe 20% of the blackberry each season, 20 to 30%, just to reduce its spread into other areas. And the other thing there too is apart from spread by birds from that site, it's really got to a point where it's not probably going to go a lot further, providing it's contained. So you may even question, and I don't know what the rest of that landscape looks like, but in that case, you might even question, whether you just prevent its spread. So it's sort of looking at the situation where it occurs and then looking at the best way of approaching it in association with the risks as well as the practicalities. And the other part of this, I suppose, is we all have limited time and resources as well. So we want to be putting those into areas that are going to have the most benefit for biodiversity or production, rather than spending all our time trying to, for example, address something like that gully. So it may be that you will do it, but it might be further down the priority list. And there's a lot of other things that need to occur in association with doing something like that. This is a case, it's on a drainage line. It's a case where an off-label permit would be appropriate because the flow is ephemeral. So you would do it at a dry time of year in that case. So ultimately what we're trying to do is maintain our diversity of not only trees, shrubs, grasses, aquatic plants, but also the in-stream complexity. And we have this campaign, which some of you will know about, called Mess It Up and Slow It Down, where we don't want clean, neat rivers. We want really complex, messy systems. This is actually the Yass River from memory. And there's some blackberry, that's all been fenced off from stock and everything. And there's just a bit of blackberry that needs to be addressed. In this case, that blackberry is not providing a lot of additional habitat because there's a lot of shrubs and grasses and things there already. And it's quite a way up off the channel, so it could easily be controlled. And it's reducing a threat to that system over time. So that's a situation where you could just spray it all and let it die there and leave the canes in place. Not that many people get rid of the canes, I must admit, but some people like to have it looking a bit more tidy. So I mentioned that. A situation like this, where whether it's the protecting natural systems like that part of the Yass River, whether it's these big rehabilitation programs where we're putting in lots and lots of time and effort to plant trees and return our native grasslands. And you can see there all the reeds that have established along this, what was an eroding gully. Over time, with management of blackberry is essential in this particular site because it will threaten all of the work that this particular landholder has done over many years. And what we find is when we're fencing off some of these systems, it doesn't matter if it's a rehabilitation, it doesn't matter whether it's a grassy, swampy meadow. What we found is once the stock are removed, that's when we start to get the infestation, little infestations that you don't really notice that suddenly become bigger and bigger plants. So the stock do keep blackberry under control because they'll graze it when it's really small. So systems like this are particularly vulnerable because this one's starting to turn back to a swampy meadow, chain of ponds type system. The reeds are starting to grow. The native grasses are starting to regenerate. And this is a setting where you would consider a very high priority, where little canes just crop up and they need to be kept on top of. So there's a lot of different situations, and it's really important to look at your own setting and your own capacity and work out what's best for you. Obviously, there's a lot of advice around as well. There's websites and control manuals. But I sometimes think it's really handy to be able to apply some of these best practice tools or all the options for control, apply them, but they need to be applied quite specifically, which is where it gets more difficult. And you really have to think about your own patch. And then I always sort of go back, I guess, to start to finish up. I go back to the reason why we do all this in the first place. And it really is, apart from the production and sustainable farming outcomes, it really is all of these sorts of critters, our Macquarie perch, our Murray crayfish, our southern pygmy perch, our platypus ricali, all of our waterway aquatic creatures that we're trying to protect habitat for. So every now and then I've just got to sort of come back and remember why I'm so interested in doing this or why I'm doing these things. And things like our little scarlet robins that come down from the mountains for the winter. They need that diversity of shrubs and things for the diversity of insects that they rely on as well. So I just wanted to put that in there to remind us, I guess, why we do a lot of these things. So that's about it. I will put up those website, I think that's there. Yes. So we've got the Rivers of Carbon website, which is really quite easy to find. And you just go into resources and there's a whole bunch of things about wombats and river vegetation and all that. And one of those is a Blackberry, it's a website that you sort of scroll through. There's a bit of a video on there of the work that was done up at Bumbalong Valley after the fire. So that's quite interesting. The guide itself is called Riparian Real Estate Guide, Managing Blackberries Around Waterways. And then the other two really good resources is New South Wales Weedwise. There's a fact sheet on blackberry. It goes through all the chemicals. The Blackberry Control Manual is very full on. It's an extensive document. But if you just go into part 4, it's where the tables are that compare all of the different chemicals and the pros and cons and which species they work on, and really get some detailed information. And also, I guess some of that legwork is taken out too. The other option is if you get professional contractors in, they will know a lot of that stuff, one would hope. So I will leave that up there, Alex, if that's all right, just for a minute. But certainly a Google search will send you to any of those places. We sort of don't print things out as much these days, but it's all there on the web, and you can download them all free and print them out if you want to.
Okay.
But yeah, well, I think that's about it.
We'll leave that there for a moment, and I might start asking you a few questions.
Sure.
Yeah. So Maraiki's cat was trying to talk to us, but we can't decipher what it said, so we'll move on to the next one. And there was just a comment there that sorry, I can't see the name. Kate said that we have similar issues on the watercourse that flows directly into the Yass River. So
yeah,
there's a few people there with issues.
Yeah.
I think we may have covered off on the is burning blackberry an option for control. So I think we've more or less said no, really, haven't you?
I did, but having said that, I mean, it does. The problem is with blackberry, you can use that as a method to reduce the canes. And I certainly know some amazing landholders out at Murrum Bateman who burnt all their blackberry, but they did have to spend a lot of years going back and spraying it with chemical, and it was a huge effort. So it's not dissimilar to something like gorse. It just loves those environments created by fire. But yeah, you certainly can, providing you're not right in the waterway, you certainly can burn it, but then you're faced with probably a greater level of follow-up than you would if you used a physical method like goats or slashing or something like that, because those methods don't put such a high level of phosphorus back into the soil.
Yeah. So I think we may have covered off on what the biological control, what we mean by biological control. There was a question there about where do you actually get those bioagents from? I know that council a couple of years ago were putting them out. Do you know anything different?
I'm not sure if landholders can just go and get them. They usually get released as part of specific programs. And my feeling now is probably Southeast Local Land Services will be doing that sort of thing, if anyone. It used to be the old, what was it? I can't remember now, Department of Ag, Land and Water or something like that. It's usually been the regional government departments that have managed that. I'm not entirely sure how they approach it these days or whether they even do it anymore. But certainly Southeast Local Land Services, I would start with to find out more about that.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll try and follow that up and let people know. There's a question there about, are we better to cut as much of it off as we can and burn it and then just poison the regrowth? What is your feeling about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the things that you're weighing up there is the effort. So do you just spray it in situ in the safest way you can? So if it's, say, right up off the waterway, for example, it might be appropriate just to spray it and leave it, because once you physically disturb it, you're looking at up to almost 2 years before you can actually then go and spray it. So all you're weighing up, I guess, is the chemical use in the first place versus your effort to reduce that bulk, and then the couple of years waiting and then ensuring that you do go back and spray it when it's actively growing. Because anything you do to it reduces the effectiveness of chemical. So it's not a case of just sort of, oh, there is actually one way you can do it, but it's quite tricky. You can actually paint the stumps or spray the stumps if you get the chemical. Say you've got someone brush cutting
Yeah.
And they're ahead of you, and you've got some glyphosate works quite well in this situation. Someone behind you spraying the cut canes can work quite well. You've got to get the chemical on within 30 seconds though. So you have to be really, really on top of what you're doing. But yeah, that can work. That's a more instantaneous effect. Whereas if you do remove the canes, let it grow back, it's a couple of years before you can spray it. It's a perfectly reasonable method. It just takes a bit longer and a lot more effort in terms of work. But the trade-off then is not using as much chemical. So
yeah,
in Christine's case, it probably is the most appropriate way to go, because that is not, it's an ephemeral creek, but even during drought, there's water holes and things in there. There's open water, and the risk of getting some of that blackberry is right in the channel of the stream. It's always got water. So in that case, you would knock it down as best you can. The problem with blackberry, it's so good, at such a great plant in terms of its ability to spread. We're really restricted in what we can actually do sensibly. To manage it. And it's just about kind of being common sense and applying all the different tools to the setting that it's in. So a big blackberry bush up in a paddock, you just spray it. The off-target risks are very low there. You could spray it with one of the non-waterway chemicals. In the river, it gets pretty tricky.
Yeah.
I like the idea of the goats. I haven't had a lot of experience with goats, so I'm really keen. And anything you do needs, if you can monitor it with lots of photos and help other people learn too, that always adds to our toolbox of options, I suppose.
So I might invite you just to stop your share now.
Yeah, sure.
I think people will have had enough time. Excellent. Brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. On my view.
So I've just lost my place now. Just getting them back. What effect does spraying while fruiting have on the birds? Like, is there a reason why we're waiting for it to fruit before we spray?
I think a lot of cases we try not to. The problem is that when it's fruiting is when it's the most actively growing and when it will take up the chemical best. I think ideally, if we can find a spot where the plants are really actively growing but aren't fruiting, would be ideal. But in some of the more less temperate climates, often you don't have that window. So I don't actually think there's a lot of research around about the effects of these chemicals on the birds. I know there's a lot of research around about frogs. I think precautionary principle, it would be better if you can to try to find that spot between it actively growing and not fruiting. But generally when it's actively growing, it's got fruit, which is why it does tend to get sprayed at that time. There's a lot of areas though where people go and collect them, like in the forestry areas where people collect them to eat. So they're quite careful not to spray at that time, but then the effectiveness of the chemical can be reduced. So it's another one of those trade-offs. I honestly can't think of specific research, and there might be some out there and I just haven't seen it. And it would be very hard to measure too, I'd imagine. The birds, the little woodland birds that the canes really suit, tend to be insectivorous. That there's the currawongs and everybody else that comes and eats the fruit, but those little red-browed finches and everything, they just eat insects. So
Okay. Do you know whether if you could slash back the blackberry and then sheet mulch it really thickly, do you think that would work and plant into that? Or do you think it would just...
It would suppress it, but I don't think it will completely get rid of it. But the problem with mulch, and I think mulch is fantastic around plants when you're planting them. Mulch suppresses everything. So you'd need to plant quite densely to actually get enough plants in there to improve diversity, because the mulch can last there for a very long time. So while you're reducing the blackberry you need to find a way to then, like, as I mentioned, the outcome being diversity, whether that's planting grasses and little shrubs and forbs and things very closely together to try to overcome that. I think you would still have blackberry coming through it. But yeah, it's trying to get that outcome of you know, improving diversity. Mulch is great for suppressing things, but it suppresses everything. So
yeah,
it's an option. It's absolutely an option.
Okay. There's just a comment there from Mariki about using goats, and she's like, they've grazed it and then they've come back worse than ever.
Okay.
So I think really that we've had some communication from the botanical gardens, one of the horticulturalists there, Phil, and he said when they've been used at the botanic gardens, they do follow up, like they do go through and do that paint method that you've just discussed. And so, you know, I think the real reality there is probably you do need to do some follow up after the goats have been through.
Yeah, definitely. Any physical methods will not kill the plant. They have up to 4 meters of roots under the soil.
Yeah.
So no matter what you do to the top, they're still there. So that's where you're doing you're trying to find a trade-off between how much chemical you use, what are alternative means, how do you reduce, you know, it's that trade-off.
Yeah, and you're grubbing out, you could be doing that. So you could be using some of those methods in combination, like you could be using the goats and then grubbing out or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And same with these landholders that burnt all theirs. They were doing a mixture of grubbing out. They were spraying the actively growing plants. I think it took years. It was like 4 or 5 years, but they eventually got on top of it. It's again trading off. It's working out your strategy. What's best for your place. Organic farmers really don't have the option of chemical use, so they need to look at ways of physically controlling it. But even really small plants to grub out, they've got really long root systems because the roots establish before the canes and then the leaves. So you need to just be really good at understanding that, you know, plants will continue to pop up if you don't get those roots. So the problem with blackberry is, as I said, it's so successful. There's no sort of magic silver bullet for them. Yeah. I love Christine's comments about the elephants because that's exactly what it's like. It's, you know, but the combination of methods is probably the most common. Other than broad scale spraying them. Yeah. So there's just a comment there from Kevin about Roy Watson from Millpost using goats. So it's interesting to hear that some landholders are using them, and that's wonderful. Yeah, we're going to get back to people about where they can get the rust. In my previous work, a couple of years ago, we did a workshop on biological control. At that time, it was the councils, but I'll clarify that. Can we plant anything along the banks to stabilise the banks? We have some very steep ones like Christine's, I think. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. If there's an undercut in the toe of the bank, that's when, say, for example, if the blackberry is in that setting, you might need to look at some structural works to make sure the toe's stable. But absolutely. And once the blackberry is reduced to canes, a lot of grasses are able to grow up through them, particularly pasture, things like phalaris, which is really common in a lot of the landscape. I know it can reduce biodiversity, but if it's already there, things like phalaris and some of the spear grasses and things will actually come up through it. But if the toe is unstable in that really sodic type soil, often we'll need to do something. It might just be a little rock groin, a little structure that sticks out of from the bank into the creek. And all it does is when water hits it, it deflects it at 90 degrees away from that unstable area. So it might be a combination in that situation of some really minor structural works. I'm not talking big earthworks, just to reduce the pressure. The other thing you can do is actually, if the setting's right, is plant aquatic plants, things like Phragmites, the Australian rush, or Carex or Poa, that sort of thing, upstream slightly of the infestation, and that will also reduce the flow velocity. And often in that setting you get the water eddying around, and that's what causes the erosion. So you can just break up that flow.
Okay.
It's quite tricky because these situations are so specific to soil types, and it is a hard one. But I think if you've got erosion, if you've got blackberry growing on a what you think is an eroding bank, it's probably worth getting some advice.
Yeah.
Getting out to actually give you site-specific advice if it's not straightforward.
Yeah. I think that sort of just sparked a bit of a question from me. Would you also fence it out and plant along that steep bank, like above, like if it's quite a big drop, would you be planting up there where it hasn't eroded yet in that instance, or is it just you need to get that site-specific advice?
Well, no, that we always encourage people to plant their riparian areas with native trees and shrubs and things just for connectivity and biodiversity. But there's a lot of research around and it's longer term, of course. So things like grasses and shrubs obviously establish quite quickly and do a good job. Tree roots actually improve the shear strength of banks by, and I can't remember what the factor was, but it was quite a large magnitude than if you didn't have them there. I think with the big trees, you just want to keep them back from the bank a bit so that the grasses aren't shaded out, because they're the quick fix for soil. But yeah, any kind of diverse native riparian vegetation will certainly, and it will also put habitat back, particularly the shrubs for little critters that are using the blackberry. So I would always advise that unless it's a grassy, swampy meadow that naturally doesn't have trees, but often these eroded waterways did in this part of the world.
Okay. So can the slashed canes resprout?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
They've
got this great strategy, particularly their roots under the soil. They have these little buds that just sit there dormant. Right. And so if something happens to them, these little buds just resprout. I think the other thing with the rust is it actually stops those buds from forming, which is another positive for it. Yeah, so their strategy is very good. They just often those little buds, it might not be the dead cane that resprouts, but the little buds that are in all those daughter plants are the ones that start to regrow again.
Okay.
If you use a non-residual chemical, the residual chemicals will actually kill those. So but you're restricted how you can use them on the waterways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Carmen's just asked if there's like blackberry on a waterway. She's talking about the Shoalhaven River here. Should you, and it's a small plant and it's not very big, should you be notifying council and seeing if they could come and spray it? What's your feeling about that?
Well, all the councils are different. Some are very, how can I politely say it? Some are very old school, prior to the changes with the Biodiversity Conservation Act in 2016. In the past, they used to come and, in some cases, spray it for you and send you a bill. In other cases, they would come and inspect your property and in some ways coerce you to, or with, through legislation, get you to spray. And then that included things like St. John's wort. The shift now is to this threat management basis of assessment. So now they're supposed to say, okay, that bit there is a threat to this, or but some of the councils haven't caught up yet. But I know the weeds inspectors all vary very much between councils. So if I had just a little bit of blackberry, I don't think you have to necessarily notify someone. You can manage it yourself. I'm not sure. I don't think they'll come and spray it for you. without some kind of bill attached. I mean, I can't speak for all the councils, but I certainly know, you know, in the past there's been a lot of costs associated with council doing things. But yeah, often if it's a small bit, you're probably best off just tackling it yourself if you can. With whatever advice you can get.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there was a comment that the ACT Southern Catchment group hire out a steam weeder.
Yeah.
Are you familiar at all of whether the steam weeding works on blackberry?
It will certainly make it stressed. Yeah. And it will probably work on really little plants. But again, as with all of these methods, it won't kill the roots under the soil and the little buds. So I think, I'm not sure, it certainly wouldn't, all it will end up doing is making a plant really stressed and difficult to control. Yeah. I think there would be better methods, but then having said that, I'm happy to be proven wrong. If there are some, you know, I'd be interested in talking to Martine and seeing what their experience has been now that they're actually using it. Okay. The feeling is it will make the plants really stressed. It will knock them back, but then they will regenerate again at some point. Yeah. So I'm just, thanks, Lori. I'm just going to let people know that we will continue for about another 5 minutes with some more questions. We have hit the 8:30 mark, but I think that, you know, if people are willing to stick with us, that we'll keep going through these questions. I'll take the opportunity while we can. So, Bruce, we can't really advise you about what density to use for the goats. That is something that is probably beyond our abilities tonight. But at the end of the webinar, I will put up a website and some information about our goat webinar where we talked about that with Elizabeth Larson. So if rust reduces the uptake of chemical, do we increase the amount of herbicide used, or how do you handle that situation? I don't think you would increase the amount of herbicide used. I think there's very strict, what do you call them, dilution rates on the different chemicals that you need to. What you would try to do, you're really only going to get a good success if there are and is enough actively growing leaves on the plant. So it depends how badly it's affected. You need enough of a cover of leaves to be able to uptake that poison. I think it would help to, in that setting, use penetrants and wetting agents to enable penetration into the leaves. But certainly compared to an actively growing bush, it's going to be less effective. Increasing the chemical, possibly it's worth looking into. What I would do there is look into, in the weed control manual, the Blackberry control manual, and look at all the different chemical combinations, because one of the combinations has glyphosate in it, and something like that would then help with the kill rate. So rather than upping the rate, it'll be more the combination of chemicals that you use appropriate for that. Some are better than others. So you need to look up that table in the Blackberry control manual and just see which one's the best option. Okay. Yeah, that's great advice. If it's got 3 leaves on a big cane, it's going to be very difficult. If it's got enough leaves and they're just stressed, then the glyphosate mix might actually be more effective. So there's a question there from John about why is a non-selective herbicide like glyphosate approved in waterways. I don't think we can really answer that. Well, with glyphosate, so in the past they had this thing called, everyone knows Roundup. What they do is they took the surfactant out of it that they found was harmful to fish and frogs, in particular aquatic life. And that's where we got bioactive Roundup, which is glyphosate, that's the trade name. And glyphosate, so I am not convinced any chemical is particularly good for waterways, but because they took that nasty surfactant out of the original Roundup, it became less, it had less of an impact on aquatic life. So that's how that came about, and then it ended up being registered for use. But having said that, back in the years ago, someone was telling me that the Roundup had someone drinking it. So to show how safe it was.
Oh, nice.
So,
Beautiful.
So we don't always know. I'm not convinced that lots of chemicals in the waterways of any description is particularly good.
Yeah. So how would you manage the banks as you're removing the blackberries? I think you've sort of answered that a little bit. You said you'd rough it up and sort of start planting other vegetation. So I think we've sort of addressed that issue in your talk. Actually, I think we have. Yeah.
It just depends on how stable the gully itself is. A lot of gullies now have reached their extent. So the amount of water that's coming down them now, the gullies tend to be wide enough to cope with that. It's only if there's a big change to runoff in the catchment, usually in association with urban development or, you know, clearing or something like that, that will significantly increase those peak flows. A lot of our gullies are already deep and wide and have been there since, a lot of them that are formed in the late 1860s when we had 3 1 in 100 events in 10 years. So, and you know, because there'll be big old trees growing in the bottom of them and all sorts of things. So those big stable gullies are not at risk. It's those smaller creeks that I showed you with the sodic soils that haven't reached their extent that are the big issue. But usually the blackberry is not providing as much stabilisation as we think for a lot of systems.
All right. Well, I think some of the other comments that I'm reading really are conversations between our guests, which is wonderful. It's great to have stimulated that interaction in our webinar. So I am going to just pop my screen share up again and wrap this up, Lori. And I'm going to just put up a photo from one of our committee members and ask her question, if that's okay. Whoops, there we go. Sorry, there we go. So this is a question from Kelly, and it's, how can I rehabilitate a gully which is actively eroding but only has the blackberry growing in it and some rubbish like old cars? The gully is below a dam.
Oh, that's the sorry.
Yeah, that's the question.
In this case, I would ask whether containment to start with, so stop it spreading beyond where it already is.
Yeah.
And then I would start to plant, if possible, plant vegetation, lots of native trees and shrubs around it.
Yeah.
And then start a process of that gradual removal or control. Again, it's probably quite a dry gully, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
And you'd start to control about 30% a year as your shrubs and trees are growing.
Yeah.
I would have a really strategic approach. I think the risk to waterways in that situation is fairly minimal. If done at the right time, but also there's a lot of grasses there that can recolonize as well. So that would be the approach I would start with.
Brilliant. Okay.
It's not easy. It's a lot of work, obviously, but it's just the reality of the situation that we have. Yeah.
Well, you must be feeling hoarse, so I'll let you have a break.
I've got a dog snoring behind me, and it's getting louder and louder. So just like, I was thinking it'll be before I embarrass myself. No,
that's fine. It's amazing that I wonder if anyone has heard my dog barking in the background, but I guess that's what we get when we're doing these things from home.
Yeah.
So just to add to your list earlier, Lori, there's some websites there for people. And just to let people know that we did record a goat webinar where we spoke to Elizabeth Larson, who runs Herds for Hire. and you can access that on our website. Elizabeth was talking about the density of the goats and you know, how she uses them in different situations. So that may be of interest to you. And I've also repeated your Weedwise recommendation there. Just to let you know that we do have some events coming up, and just to follow on from this webinar tonight, we're going to go to Christine's place on Saturday and visit the site and continue the discussion in person. If you did want to go to that, I'd just encourage you to register tonight if possible, just so that I can make sure that we get the catering for you. And the other events that we'll be running will be advertised in our newsletter and on Facebook. So we do have some more webinars coming up over winter. As I said, it'd be great if you could send me some feedback either by doing the survey, or you can also send me an email. We have a discussion group on Facebook, which is your opportunity to join us and talk to us about your farm and tell us any stories that you'd like to tell us, or share photos and stuff like that. So I just encourage you to join us if you'd like to do that. We have recorded all of our previous webinars and put them on the YouTube channel. And we also have some small videos there, or short videos there, about different things like managing sheep. We've had a chat there with Wendy about small scale poultry production. So if you wanted to catch up on all things small farms, you can definitely do it on the YouTube channel. And just a reminder about our website and the Facebook page. And also just to let you know that you can become a member of the Small Farms Network. It costs $22 per financial year. And your membership helps us run events like this one and goes towards the administration of the association. Members of the Small Farm Network receive the following benefits, including early alerts for upcoming workshops, member newsletters, discounts for some events, and the opportunity to participate in special interest groups. You can also send me notices to advertise in the Small Farms Network newsletter, such as farm animals for sale or equipment or help wanted. If you don't want to do any of that, you're more than welcome to go to our free, sign up for our free newsletter on the website, and also check out our resources page, which has lots of information that you may be interested in. So thank you, Lori, and thank you, Christine, for joining us tonight. It's been a really great presentation, and I'm really grateful for the time you've devoted to it.
Thank you, Ali.
Okay, all right.
For organising it all.
No worries at all.
Thank you for everyone's interaction. The chat has been really, really interesting to follow. So some really interesting comments on the chat. Thanks, everyone.
Looking forward to Saturday.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you again. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.